The last speaker before I call for contributions and discussion is one of the founders and convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Please welcome Lindsey.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks for everybody's patience with this kind of the meetings, everyone going off to the other meeting and everything else. But I think it's a fantastic turnout in terms of people wanting to be concerned about this issue. And I don't want to go through the whole things that you've now heard a whole number of speakers who've made the points about the Middle East. I don't want to repeat all of those because I'm sure we want some time for discussion. I want to make a few points though. First is that The Guardian a couple of years ago, in one of its better articles, actually said that Britain had been at war somewhere in the world every year for the last 100 years, right? Since 1914, there has always been a time when Britain has been at war. And we pay for this in all sorts of ways. We pay for it by the cost of the war and the cost of Trident and the cost of all those sorts of things. We pay for it in terms of the instability in the world. We pay for it in terms of the priorities of this society, which are very, very much to prioritise war as opposed to spending on welfare, spending on education, any of those other sorts of things. But of course we pay for it as well in the way that people look at Britain and the way that people look at Britain in the world. And in particular, we have now had this war on terror for nearly 14 years. So some people in the room probably weren't even at primary school when it started, or only just at primary school. Some of us are obviously a good bit older than that. But nonetheless, that is a fantastically long time to have a war. It's longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War, longer than both of them put together. And it was called the War on Terror in 2001. It has singularly failed to achieve its aim. Terrorism is a much bigger threat now than it was in 2001. When 9/11 happened, everybody said that was a dreadful event. It was a shocking atrocity with 3,000 people killed in New York and Washington and elsewhere. But what we said then was very, very simple. We said that any war which tries to avenge the events of 9/11 by killing people in Afghanistan, in Iraq, since then in Libya, in Syria and elsewhere, any war that does that will create far more casualties, will create far more hostility to the Western world, and will not deal with any of the political grievances that were said at the time were the causes of the war. And let's remember, of the attack on 9/11, let's remember what they were. What they said as the reason for carrying out 9/11, and there's no justification for it, but the political reasons they gave were these. One was the state of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are in a worse position now than they were in 2001. The second was the sanctions on Iraq. Well, we don't have sanctions on Iraq anymore, but we have had a war, an invasion, an occupation, and the absolute devastation of the country. Of course, now we're bombing it again. That's the second thing. The third thing was that Al-Qaeda objected to American troops on Saudi soil. Now, if you look at the Middle East today, there are far more Western troops in far more countries than was the case back in 2001. And of course, as previous speakers have said, we now have the prospect of a British base in Bahrain, a British base back east of Suez. And for those of us of my generation will remember from the 1960s that one of the main claims of the Labour government at that time was that it would withdraw all British troops and all British military intervention east of Suez. That has been reversed now, and that's quite a big reverse. It's a reverse which means that they are seeing the intervention in the Middle East not as something which just goes on for a few years, but something which is a permanent feature of what we do. And it seems to me that if you look at that, that is a very, very serious problem that we have. There are other consequences of this war. One is the attack on civil liberties. If you look at the laws that have been passed, if you look at trying to get into this building, and no doubt many of you have found that tonight, the levels of security now necessary in these places is greater than it has ever been. And we should know from the history, both of this last 13 or 14 years, and from previous history of people like the Irish who had exactly the same sorts of laws applied against them in the 1970s and 80s, most of whom, by the way, were found to have been complete miscarriages of justice, the people who ended up in prison as a result of those laws. We should know that none of them work, that the only thing that works in the end to deal with terrorism is you have to have a political solution. And if you don't have a political solution, those questions will still continue. The third problem, and it's one that perhaps I think, certainly I feel most worried about at the moment, and I guess many people here will also feel very, very worried, which is that after the events in Paris 2 weeks ago, there has been a rise in Islamophobia, there has been a rise in the number of attacks on Muslims. There was an anti-Islamic demonstration held in Dresden, as there is in Germany, as there has been every week for a number of weeks. Last week, a young African man was murdered the same night as the demonstration. There was a man murdered in the south of France, with the murderer, who was obviously seriously mentally ill, but the murderer shouting anti-Islamic slogans when he killed him. There are many, many reports in all the mosques that I hear about and the cultural centres and so on of people being abused, of people having abusive letters sent to them, and in some cases worse. In France, grenades thrown at mosques, attacks on mosques, all this kind of thing. This is a fantastically serious problem, and we have a situation where the terrorism is created or is made much, much worse by the war. The terrorism itself helps to feed this Islamophobia. We have far-right parties across Europe, in Germany, in France with the National Front, and here in Britain with UKIP, who do everything. Report set up in 2009 was supposed to deal with Tony Blair, Jack Straw, all the other people who took us to war on the basis of complete lies and fabrication, and who have never been held to account. Now, nobody knows when this report is going to come out. Is it going to come out before the election? Looks very unlikely. Will it come out just after the election? Well, it depends how much the various people who are criticised within it, including Blair, how much they actually want in any way to be criticised publicly. So even at the very simplest levels of democratic accountability, there are none. We don't want these wars. 2 million people marched against the war in 2003, and yet we are still stuck with these wars and the terrible consequences of them. And as Seamus says, this is a consequence which goes on and on and on. And it will be war without end unless we break this idea, unless we break the political consensus which says that these wars are justified and the only way you fight terrorism is by having more wars and by having more Islamophobia and more attacks on civil liberties. It is a disaster for everybody concerned, and it's something we have to reverse. Now, I just want to conclude really by saying that I think one of the most important things in this country is that because we had such a big anti-war movement, we've built a movement and a consensus among a very large proportion of the population that these wars are wrong. We've also got many, many people who don't like Islamophobia and don't like the attacks on civil liberties. But we know this is a difficult time. We know we have the media, we have government demanding all the time that Muslims have to dress in certain ways, that Muslims have to behave in certain ways, and most importantly that Muslims have to continually apologise for the fact that they opposed these disastrous wars in the first place. And all of those things, I think we have to say, are making the situation worse. So this is really a plea to everybody tonight. Thank you very, very much for coming, but don't just leave it at coming to the meeting. Please do get involved in Stop the War. Please do get active, sign up to all the activities. We have a meeting on the 12th of February on Islamophobia, which I hope you will all, and the connection with war, which I hope you will all come to. The demonstration against racism on March the 21st, which we're supporting. It's organised by all sorts of different groups in anti-racist and groups in this country. I think it has to be a very, very important demonstration. It has to be a demonstration where we stand up to racism and stand up against Islamophobia as well. So that is very important for us as well. And on the 6th of June, we're having a conference at the Trade Union TUC headquarters, where all the speakers, I hope, who have been speaking tonight, and many, many more, will come and discuss all day some of the issues that we've talked about, because we have to get organised. We have to say to the government, who will try their best to ignore all this, in the run-up to the election. And it isn't, incredibly in this country, it's not an election issue. You know, you can talk about all sorts of other things, but it's got nothing to do with the war. Well, let's make it an election issue. Let's make it something where we want to know what our government, what the different parties are saying about the wars, about weapons, about Trident, about Palestine, about all these questions. It should be an election issue, but it isn't just about the election. It's about how we change the policies, how we change the foreign policy, and how we begin to develop a world where we're not faced with these endless wars, but where we can begin to build justice and peace.